Thursday night, I remember the feeling of the steering wheel under my hands as I pulled into the gravel driveway, the way the house looked against the gray sky. I thought I was doing the right thing, visiting my parents, being present for my daughter, Freya, who had been staying with them for a couple of weeks after graduating. I thought maybe it would help her. I was tired from the drive, but determined to be the good daughter, the good mother. The plan was to have a quiet family dinner at the house in the countryside, a place I'd always considered more rundown than retreat, but it was tradition. I carried a bottle of wine inside, balancing it with my bag in the sense that maybe this time we'd have a normal evening. Inside, everyone was there. My mother was pouring wine. My father was talking about golf, or maybe the weather. My sister was on her phone, barely looking up. Freya sat next to me, quiet, a little withdrawn, but she smiled when she saw me. She had been quieter than usual since Uncle Henry died. He was the one person in our family who seemed to really see her. His passing left a hole in her that I didn't know how to fill. She answered my calls less and less after that, always sounding tired. I had convinced myself that was normal. Grief does strange things. Dinner began. There was the usual food, burgers, potato salad, tomatoes, the kind of meal that's supposed to make things feel simple. The conversation flowed around me. I watched the way my mother kept refilling glasses, my father cracking jokes, my sister mostly ignoring everything. There was a man there, someone they introduced as a friend, but I had no memory of meeting him before. He smiled at me and I smiled back, out of habit. Freya was sitting beside me. I could feel her tension, the way her hands fidgeted in her lap. It was like she wanted to say something, but couldn't. Then, just as my father raised his glass for a toast, she slipped a note into my hand, a scrap of notepad paper folded twice. I opened it under the table, trying not to draw attention. 2 words. Call 911. It was written in her handwriting, all capital letters. I stared at it, my mind suddenly blank. Freya stared straight ahead. I felt my heart rate rise, but I tried to keep my face calm. I told myself maybe she was joking. Maybe this was some terrible misunderstanding. But her hand was shaking, her leg bouncing beneath the table. I tried to think. Why would she do this? What had happened? I excused myself to the bathroom, bag in hand. My mind was racing. I locked the door behind me, sat down on the closed toilet, pulled out my phone. I could barely hold it steady enough to unlock the screen. I called 911 and gave the address. My voice cracked, but I forced myself to explain. My daughter gave me a note and she looked scared. I didn't know what was happening. I just knew she was in trouble and I had to do something. The dispatcher kept calm. I gave as much information as I could. When I hung up, I just sat there, hands shaking, heart pounding. I had to go back out there, sit with my family, and pretend nothing was wrong. I was terrified. I didn't know if I was overreacting or if I was about to uncover something I couldn't handle. I walked back to the table, picked up my glass, and tried to act normal. The seconds dragged on, every moment feeling like I was on the edge of something irreversible. Sitting there, I watched my family, my mother pouring more wine, my father laughing, my sister glued to her phone. The friend watched me too. I wondered if he knew. I wondered what Freya had been through these last 2 weeks. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something important. I tried to read Freya's face to catch her eye, but she avoided my gaze. I felt a familiar emptiness settle in my stomach, the same feeling I had as a child when I realized love in this family wasn't unconditional. That affection was something you earned and sometimes didn't. As I waited, I replayed the last few weeks in my head. Freya grieving, shutting down, refusing to talk about Uncle Henry, the invitation from my parents for her to stay with them, their assurances that she just needed rest, that family would help her heal. I believed them. I wanted to believe them. I needed to believe that we were better than what I feared. But now, all I could do was wait and hope I hadn't already failed her. When the knock came at the door, I knew it was the police. Everything stopped. My father's joke hung in the air. Unfinished. My mother froze with the wine glass in her hand. My sister looked at the door, confused. Freya sat still, eyes wide but silent. I stood up, almost on autopilot, and walked to the door. I opened it and saw two officers. They asked if I was the one who called. I nodded. They asked where my daughter was. I pointed to the table. They took Freya aside to talk. I went outside with one of the officers. The air was cold and sharp. I stood on the porch, staring at the garden, unable to move. I kept thinking about what Freya had written, about how I hadn't noticed sooner, about how everything could have been different if I'd paid more attention. Minutes passed, slow and heavy. I waited for someone to tell me what was happening, for someone to explain. But all I had were questions and the sick feeling that everything was about to change. Standing outside, I tried to keep my breathing even. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I watched the light from the living room fall across the porch, the blurred outlines of people moving behind the curtains. I wanted to run back inside, to protect Freya, to pull her away from everyone, but I knew I had to wait. I kept replaying everything, every conversation with my parents, every moment leading up to tonight. I realized how many details I'd missed, how my mother had insisted Freya needed rest, how my father had been so eager for me to leave Freya with them. I thought about how often I told myself they were just awkward with emotions, not malicious. Now all those excuses felt flimsy. When the officers called me back in, I noticed the atmosphere had changed. Everyone was silent, their faces tight, their smiles gone. The female officer stood next to Freya, who looked exhausted and scared, but somehow more present than before. I listened as Freya explained to the officer what had happened. She spoke in short, clipped sentences, describing how she'd been isolated, how they'd pressured her to sign documents she didn't understand, how the man, supposedly a lawyer, had arrived and told her it was all for her benefit. She hadn't wanted to sign, hadn't wanted to agree to anything, but they'd kept pushing, telling her it was just paperwork, that she'd thank them later. I felt the urge to interrupt, to demand answers, but I stayed quiet. The officers moved efficiently. They started searching the house, asking everyone to stay in the living room. My mother protested. My father tried to reason. My sister rolled her eyes, but no one left the room. I sat next to Freya, holding her hand. I tried not to let my anger show. It was strange, being in that house, surrounded by the people I'd grown up with, knowing that the rules had changed forever. I realized how much I had ignored over the years. I had accepted their coldness, their indifference, as normal. I had decided it was better to have distant parents than none at all. The officers returned with evidence. Loose pills in a bag, papers with Freya's name, unsigned legal documents. They searched every room, including the basement, which I'd never seen before. It was furnished neat and sterile. There was a bolt on the outside of the door, a window that didn't open, and Freya's things laid out as if she were meant to live there, alone and unseen. Her phone and wallet were locked away upstairs. I kept thinking about all the small moments I had dismissed, how my mother always controlled the keys, how she insisted Freya needed to be cut off from distractions, how no one ever let her go anywhere alone. My parents tried to explain themselves, their voices rising and falling, trying to find some justification. They said Freya was grieving, that she was unstable, that everything they did was for her own good. I listened to them, feeling more distant from them than ever. It was like I was watching a family I barely recognized. The police took their statements, wrote down everything, collected the evidence. My anger grew, mixing with guilt. I kept thinking about all the times I should have trusted my instincts, all the moments I let politeness win over action. When it was over, the officers led my parents, my sister, and the so-called lawyer out of the house. They didn't look at me. They didn't say anything. I stayed with Freya. I didn't let her go. I sat next to her while the paramedics checked her. I watched her shiver, eyes closed, face pale and drawn. I tried to comfort her, but I knew that words would mean nothing. I realized how much I'd failed her, how much I'd let my own fears dictate my actions. I wanted to believe my parents could change, that their intentions weren't cruel, but the facts were clear. They had drugged her, isolated her, manipulated her. For what? Money? Control? I couldn't process it yet. That night, after the house was empty, after Freya and I had returned to the city, I lay awake in the dark. I kept seeing Freya's face, hearing her voice as she told the officer what had happened. I thought about the generations of silence in my family, the way we all learned to pretend, to minimize, to accept. I thought about my childhood, about all the times I'd been told to quiet down, to behave, to be grateful. I realized I had spent my life protecting my parents from the consequences of their own limitations, and that I had taught Freya to do the same, until tonight. Now, the silence in the house was gone, replaced by the reality of what had happened. I couldn't look away. I couldn't excuse it. I was left with the weight of my choices and the knowledge that from this point on, nothing would be the same. In the days that followed, everything moved in slow motion. Freya and I stayed in my apartment in the city, both of us exhausted in ways I hadn't thought possible. She barely spoke, rarely ate, jumped at every unexpected sound. I tried to reassure her, but my words felt thin. I locked every door, checked every window twice before bed, and found myself flinching at the sound of the phone. I reported everything to the police, gave statements, answered their questions over and over, retold the story until the facts blurred, and only the dread remained. Sleep was fractured. I replayed every moment in that house, every time I dismissed a sign, every time I excused my parents' behavior as just their way. I realized how easily you can convince yourself that harm is impossible in a family that appears so normal. I kept waiting for the feeling of safety to return, but it didn't. Freya was afraid to be alone, and I understood it all too well. She stayed close, followed me from room to room. I saw her staring out the window, phone in hand, as if waiting for someone to appear. She checked the locks herself before bed, even the bathroom door. The investigation was underway, but my parents and sister were released on bail while the process dragged on. The lawyer was out too, all of them moving through the world as if nothing had happened. I saw their names on the paperwork, read the legal language that tried to make sense of what had happened, but it all felt distant. I knew what Freya and I had lived through. I knew what it was to be told, again and again, that you're imagining things, that you're overreacting, that you should be grateful. The real world moves slowly in matters like this. The charges were pending, the court dates set, but every day felt like a test of endurance. My parents tried to contact us. They left voicemails, sent texts, even mailed letters. I didn't answer. I listened to one message from my mother, her voice flat and insistent, talking about misunderstanding, about how she and my father had only wanted what was best for Freya. I deleted it halfway through. Freya played me a recording she'd made the day my parents broke their bail conditions and came to the apartment. They'd shown up when I was out at a meeting. She'd managed to record the conversation on her phone, her voice quiet, theirs syrupy and manipulative, telling her how sensitive she was, how difficult things had become, how unfair it was for Henry to leave her the estate. They told her it would ruin the family. I listened to their words, to the way they twisted concern into pressure, and I felt a cold certainty that this had never been about love. I called the police again. I reported the violation. I packed our bags and moved us to a short-term rental across town. The place was smaller, older, but it had heavy doors and a neighbor who watched everything. Freya didn't argue, she just stayed close, still wary, still unable to settle. The order of no contact was granted quickly. I did everything by the book, hoping it would be enough to keep us safe until the trial. Interviews with the authorities followed, one after another. My parents, my sister, the lawyer, each one questioned separately. They began to turn on each other. My sister was first, blaming my mother, saying she'd only followed along. My mother blamed the lawyer, claimed ignorance about the drugs, insisted Freya was just unstable. My father distanced himself, claimed he hadn't known about the medications, that the locked room was only meant for Freya's protection. The lawyer confessed to everything, provided records, emails, draft documents, even one labeled worst-case scenario script. I read the evidence, saw my daughter's name on every page, and felt my stomach twist. The charges came: false imprisonment, coercion, drugging, conspiracy, fraud. Sentences were handed down. My father, prison time. My mother, less but still real. My sister, some months served. The lawyer, disbarred, convicted. I sat in the courtroom, numb, watching the people who raised me reduced to case numbers and legal statements. It didn't feel like closure. It felt like grief in a new shape. Freya was quiet through it all. She sat beside me in court, silent, head down, her hands always searching for something to hold on to. I wanted to fix things for her, to take away the fear and doubt, but I knew I couldn't. All I could do was stay close, refuse to look away, and hope that the truth would be enough for her to heal. Every day I reminded myself that action mattered more than words, that believing her, protecting her, was what counted now. The trial ended, the sentences were announced, and the world outside kept moving, indifferent. I tried to breathe, tried to imagine a time when my family would mean something different than danger. The process was slow. The reality of what had happened would take much longer to settle. 3 months after the sentencing, the estate was finally settled. I remember sitting in the office of a lawyer I had never met before, the smell of coffee and paper in the air, Freya next to me, quiet but alert. The new lawyer was gentle, businesslike, no hint of the smugness I remembered from the man my parents had hired. Freya was handed a thick packet, legal language and numbers and signatures. It was all hers now, what Uncle Henry had left, every dollar and asset and promise that my parents had tried so desperately to take away from her. I watched her hold the papers, hands trembling, and I saw her begin to cry, not from relief or happiness, but because she finally believed it was over. We went home that afternoon. The first thing Freya did was lock the door behind us. She went straight to her room and didn't come out for a long time. When she did, she hugged me tightly. There were no words. For days afterward, she drifted through the apartment like someone learning how to breathe again. I tried to make things feel normal, cooked her favorite meals, suggested we go to the park, offered to help her make plans for school. She agreed sometimes, but mostly she stayed close to home. Close to me, close to the safety she was still learning to trust. I thought a lot about what safety means. For most of my life, I had assumed that family was the place you were safest, that no matter how flawed or cold or distant, they would never cross the line into cruelty. Now I saw how wrong I had been. The danger had never been dramatic or obvious. It was quiet, logical, wrapped in routine, hidden in paperwork and household rules, and phrases like, "for your own good." I realized that I had spent years teaching myself to minimize, to overlook, to smooth over. I had become so good at surviving that I didn't notice when the threat was real. Freya slowly began to heal. There were still nights when she woke up shaking, still moments when a knock at the door made her freeze. But she laughed again sometimes. She started reading books, making plans for classes, calling friends she hadn't spoken to in months. I saw the color come back to her life, little by little. I tried to support her without smothering, to listen without pressing, to let her move at her own pace. I realized how much damage can be done by people who call themselves protectors and how much healing requires space, patience, and real care. I also found myself questioning every memory I had of my own childhood. I remembered the coldness of my parents, the way they measured love in small, precise gestures, never quite enough to feel secure. I realized I had spent years convincing myself that their limitations weren't harmful, that I was simply too sensitive or demanding. Watching what happened to Freya forced me to reconsider everything, to accept that kindness without empathy is not enough, that politeness can be a mask for neglect and even abuse. The weeks passed. I arranged for Freya to see a therapist, someone who specialized in trauma. The first few sessions were hard for her, but she came home quieter, sometimes a little lighter. I made sure the locks on our doors worked, changed our routines, avoided the parts of town where I might run into my family. I didn't want to see them, didn't want to hear their justifications or apologies or explanations. I blocked their numbers, told mutual friends not to give out our address. I wanted to give Freya every chance to feel secure. I also tried to forgive myself, little by little. I realized that guilt would never make me a better mother, but action might. I told myself that I had done what mattered most in the end. I had listened. I had acted. I had protected her when it counted. It wasn't enough to erase the damage, but it was a start. I let myself grieve for the family I thought I had, for the childhood I tried so hard to believe was normal, for the faith I'd placed in people who had never earned it. I focused on Freya, on her future, on the small moments of peace we could create for ourselves. The past was still there, but it didn't control us anymore. For the first time in a long time, I felt something close to hope. After the dust settled, life began to reshape itself around new routines and quiet precautions. The trial, the paperwork, the endless questions from police and social workers all faded into a kind of background noise, replaced by smaller daily challenges. Freya and I were safe, at least as safe as anyone can feel after their entire sense of family has been pulled out from under them. There was a numbness at first. Simple things like grocery shopping or walking to the mailbox took on a different weight. I noticed how often I checked over my shoulder, how I listened for footsteps in the hallway, how I watched every car that slowed down on our street. Freya struggled with trust. It was visible in the way she flinched at unexpected sounds or avoided answering unknown numbers. She kept to herself, guarded even in her own home. She rarely slept through the night. Every creak of the floor, every knock at the door made her tense up. I tried to create a sense of normalcy, but it was forced, fragile, as if a single careless word might shatter the thin peace we'd built. I enrolled her in self-defense classes, not because I believed she was in physical danger anymore, but because I wanted her to feel strong, to take back a small measure of control. School was another hurdle. She was accepted to a university, and we celebrated quietly, just the two of us. When the acceptance letter arrived, she stared at it for a long time, unsure if she could believe that good things could still happen. I reassured her as best I could. We filled out forms, made lists, toured the campus together, but she kept asking what would happen if someone tried to find her. I didn't lie. I told her we'd stay vigilant, that we'd use the legal protections we had, that I would always believe her, no matter what. Over time, the questions came less often. My own days were divided between work, paperwork, and rebuilding a sense of home. I worked remotely, grateful for the flexibility. Every day I checked in with Freya, cooked her favorite meals, watched her draw or read in the sunlight near the window. Sometimes I caught her smiling, genuinely, lost in a story or a memory that had nothing to do with our family. Those moments gave me strength, proof that recovery was possible, that the damage was not total. Still, fear lingered. My parents' faces appeared in my dreams. I woke up sweating, convinced I'd heard the key turn in the lock, that someone was standing over my bed. I changed our locks again, updated security cameras, memorized the procedures for restraining orders and police contacts. It seemed excessive, but I knew better than to relax too soon. The day my parents and the lawyer were released on bail, I felt a familiar sickness in my stomach, a reminder that justice is rarely perfect and that abusers rarely see themselves as such. They tried to contact us, each in their own way. My mother sent emails apologizing without admitting guilt, talking about misunderstandings and second chances. My father sent a letter from prison, heavy with self-pity and accusations. My sister messaged Freya on social media, pretending nothing had happened. We ignored every attempt. I taught Freya how to block numbers, to recognize manipulation dressed as remorse. I reminded myself, again and again, that no apology could erase what they'd done. For the first time, I looked at my childhood honestly. I accepted that the distance, the coldness, The constant pressure to perform had always been forms of harm, even if no one called them abuse. I realized I'd been trained to doubt my own perceptions, to defer to authority, to keep peace at all costs. It was only when I saw those same patterns repeated with Freya that I found the strength to break them. My loyalty had always been to an idea of family that never really existed. Freya's healing was not linear. Some days were good, filled with laughter, hope, planning for the future. Other days were lost to exhaustion, flashbacks, the urge to retreat. I learned to be patient, to celebrate the progress and accept the setbacks. Therapy helped her, slowly. She began to trust her own voice again, to believe she deserved safety, deserved love that didn't come with conditions or demands. I watched her set boundaries, speak up for herself, reclaim the parts of her life that had been taken. I changed too. I learned to trust my instincts, to listen to discomfort, to act rather than minimize. I stopped explaining away cruelty, stopped searching for reasons to forgive the unforgivable. I set boundaries with extended family, with old friends who refused to see what had happened. I accepted that my definition of family would always be smaller now, but also stronger, built on truth rather than denial. Each day, I reminded myself that what mattered was not perfection, but presence. The willingness to stand up, to bear witness, to choose action when silence is easier. By the end of summer, the weight of fear had lessened, replaced by a new sense of determination. I knew the past would never fully leave us. The memories would always be there, the scars permanent. But I also knew that Freya and I had survived, and that survival was its own form of victory. We were building something new, not what I had hoped for, not what tradition promised, but something real, imperfect, and ours. For the first time, the future felt like a place we could shape, not just endure. When autumn arrived, it was almost a relief, the steady change in weather, the routines of the city, the sense of time moving forward. Freya started classes, hesitant at first, but then, little by little, she settled into the rhythm of lectures and assignments. She still called me on breaks. Sometimes she needed reassurance, sometimes just to hear a familiar voice. I never tired of those calls, no matter how brief or repetitive. Each one felt like proof she was still choosing life, still pushing against the isolation her own family had tried to force on her. I kept my own life, small, focused. I worked, kept the apartment running, managed the legal loose ends. The trial was over, but there were still forms, restitution, messages from lawyers, the need to update addresses and security measures. Some nights I sat at the kitchen table staring at all the paperwork, feeling the reality settle in. What happened to us wasn't a story, but a wound that needed ongoing care. Even with the convictions, with the money settled, with the no-contact orders in place, I understood there was no real ending. There was only the next day, the next decision, the ongoing choice to keep each other safe. Freya changed in ways I hadn't expected. She spoke more about her own needs, her own limits. She set boundaries with friends, said no when she needed to, asked for space without apology. I recognized some of those behaviors as survival tactics, but I also saw strength growing in her, a kind of self-advocacy that I wished I'd learned earlier in my own life. Sometimes, in the evenings, we talked about the future, not in grand plans, but in small, concrete terms. What she wanted to study, where she might want to live, whether she felt ready to travel again. I let her guide those conversations. I learned not to push, not to fix, only to listen. I thought about my own role, about what it means to be a mother when the greatest danger comes from the family itself. There was shame in that, for a long time. I struggled with guilt, with regret over what I hadn't seen, what I'd let slide for so many years. But as the months passed, I started to accept that shame is a useless burden, that vigilance and presence matter more than self-blame. I saw how important it was to believe the people you love, to pay attention when something feels wrong, even if it makes you look foolish or paranoid. I had spent my life minimizing my instincts to keep the peace, to preserve an idea of family that never truly existed. That instinct almost cost Freya everything. The aftermath was quieter than I'd imagined. No one from my family tried to contact us again, not directly. The distance I'd put between us was enough. Old friends faded away. Some didn't understand, others just didn't want to get involved. I let them go. Freya and I made new routines, built new connections where we could. The holidays were just the two of us, for the first time in years. It felt strange, empty, but also peaceful. There were no arguments, no false laughter, no pressure to pretend, just a quiet meal, candles, music. For the first time, I let myself enjoy the absence of drama. I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened, not just as a sequence of events, but as a lesson. I learned that family can be both a source of comfort and of harm. I learned how easy it is to mistake control for care, routine for safety, politeness for love. I learned to act, to intervene, to trust my own eyes. I learned that protection is not a single moment, but a series of choices, repeated day after day, sometimes for years. And I learned that recovery is possible, but only if you accept the truth of what happened. Freya is different now, but not broken. She is cautious, but she's growing. I'm different too, less willing to tolerate lies, less desperate for acceptance. We're both still healing, and maybe always will be, but we are free. There are moments of laughter now, real laughter, not the kind you fake for appearances. There is quiet and peace, and a new understanding of what it means to be safe. I don't know if I did everything right. I don't know if I could have saved her sooner or protected her better, but I know that when it mattered most, I chose to believe her. I chose to act, and I know that's what matters now. If anyone is listening to this, if you see something that doesn't feel right, pay attention. Family is not immunity from harm. Love is not a guarantee of safety. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to look away. That's what saved us. That's what gave us a second chance.